Okay, it is now 3 minutes past the hour, and we'll go ahead and get started. Before we do so, I just want to make sure that my audio is coming through clearly. So if you can hear me right now, could you please go into the Q&A and just let me know that you can hear me? Perfect. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. Today is a really interesting training that we really don't talk about very often, even inside Alteryx, is these tools of running totals and weighted averages. So hopefully today, if you haven't worked with these tools before, they're pretty straightforward, but what we want to give to you is some use cases and which you might want to think of them and really enhance your analytical capabilities. My name is Joe Miller. I'm the Learning Strategy Manager here at Alteryx, and hopefully today we get you on board with these tools. Just as housekeeping notes here, by default, everybody is muted. I am monitoring the Q&A as they do come in. So if you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and ask them inside that Q&A, and I'll make sure that those get answered. At the end of that session, if there's anything else that we want to follow up on or we want to experiment with, we can certainly talk about that as well. Okay, agenda for today is just go through some workflow background, what we're going to be covering today at a very high level, and an introduction to these two tools that we'll be working with today. Then we're going to jump into the designer and build out two separate use cases, and then finally follow up with some support items. Now at this point, usually I introduce some upcoming trainings, but over the next 2 weeks we will not be hosting live trainings, mainly because we are full steam ahead on preparing for our conference called Inspire. If you have not signed up for Inspire, I'd highly recommend you do so. There's only a limited amount of time left available here, but you can see it starts in 12 days. But here you can go in and hear everything from our CEO, Dean Stoker's keynote to product trainings, the only time out of every year that we deliver training from our associates within our organization, and then hear about other people in your industry that are using Alteryx and how they might be using it. So really exciting. It's always a big event for us every year, but we will not be hosting trainings that week because we will be hosting them at Inspire instead. So that's just a note on the upcoming workflow backgrounds. We will be resuming training coming up here in the beginning of June, the week following the June 5th through 7th where our conference is at. So right around June 12th, it will be our next training. If you have any questions that go beyond today's training or you want to know more about tools like these, you can find your answers quickly by going to the Alteryx community. If you haven't visited, I would highly recommend you do so. It's one of the greatest resources that we at Alteryx have to offer, and you can get there by going to community.alteryx.com. And more than likely, in order to get here today, you went through community as a part of this meeting invite. So if I were just to bring up the live training page, today we can see that we're in running totals and weighted averages. And what I'll do after this course today is I'll be posting a playback of this video. So if for any reason I was running fast or you just want to review, this video will be available for your playback. Additionally, you can see below I've included some zipped files where you can download either the starting workflow, how I will be building them today, or the completed workflows, so you can just follow along with me. So you can use those as resources throughout your course today. And if you already missed this page, I'll just go ahead and enter it into the chat window so you can reference back to it. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Two use cases today. One, we're going to focus on using kind of weighted averages, and the other, a running total. So our first use case is that essentially I'm in charge of accepting or denying students admittance to a university, right? I'm here looking at student GPA scores, their resumes, whatever it may be, and I really want to cater to a certain department within my school. Maybe my students are opting for certain colleges, and I have one enrollment spot left that I have available, and we have a lot of a good ratio of instructors to students in my English department, and I really want the highest overall GPA, but with a slight weighting towards someone who is a little bit more specialized in the arts, more particularly English. So we're going to go through that use case and decide which student best fits our program based on their class scores. The second use case that we're going to be running today is we're going to try to decide how to develop a marketing region. Okay, and this marketing region is going to be defined as how much of our customers account for 80% of our total sales as they start to grow, right? So, for example, if I was looking at a radius of a quarter mile from my store, does that account for 50%, 60%, right? How big does that radius need to be until we capture 80% of our total scores? And we are going to use a running total tool to help create that. So the key concepts, it's right there in the title. We're going to cover some of the weighted averages, the running totals, and some of the other tools that we can expect to cover today are things like the join, the filter, and the formula, and the summarize. A lot of these we can do in different ways. However, you may be able to identify ways that you can more optimally develop your workflows based on your newfound knowledge of weighted average and running total. So what is the weighted average tool? So the weighted average tool is very straightforward. It's very easy to configure. There's a few selections that you need to make when you go into weighting an average. So in this case, I have a table and I just have a single student, right? The student has taken math, they've taken science, they've taken English. And in this case, if I were just to take a straight average of them, it would just be the summation of their grades divided by the number of them, right? Which would come out to an 89%. However, if I wanted to go to a weighted average, I would create some sort of multiplier or some sort of coefficient in order to weight my grade. So in this case, what I'm really saying is that the weight of science to math should be 5 times of that of math and English. So when I put that in, what the new weighted average calculation becomes is that grade times its weight for each of these respective subjects, and then divided by the number of parts that we've created. So in this case, divided by 7. So we've got a stronger weight towards our overall total. So sometimes the average just doesn't take the whole picture. Sometimes we have a preference on how we want to set our average, and that's what we're going to cover there. And then finally, the running total tool. And let me cover one more thing in here. The one more thing that I want to cover is grouping fields. All this is really saying is, how do you want to do your weighted average? Do you want to weight it on the total data set that you have? Do you want to weight it on a per student basis, on a per subject basis, on a per grade basis? In this case, it makes sense on a per student basis because we're making decisions on students. We want to weight their grades. So we're going to go ahead and say, hey, for each student, create a separate calculation to weight their average. Then we have the running total tool, which really all it does is go vertically down your field and add what the previous number was to the number before. So if my last week was $1 of sales and I had $2 this week, right, my running total would be 3. And then if I had $2 more the next week, my running total will be 5. And we keep adding up to a max total. Now, you can reset these running total fields based on some sort of value, right? Do you want to reset the running total per store number? So you only run a total for that store, and then when you arrive on a new store, do you want to run that start at 0 again? Or if you deselect this, it will just run the whole running total across the data set. And so we'll see an application of that today in terms of calculating some sort of marketing region. So let's go ahead and jump into Designer. I'm going to go ahead and launch a new instance here. And the first case that we're going to cover is around our students, okay? Who do we accept? Who do we want to accept? So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to, by default, if you downloaded this file, you would have this little text file, text input file dropped in there. And you can see that I have three different students that I'm trying to decide between: John, Mary, and Bob. Now, this is easy in the sense that it's a very small data set, so we'd probably be able to eyeball it. Where we come into a lot of value for this weighted average is when you start to get into more of a wealth of data. So what many people would typically do if they were not experienced with the weighted average, they just might go in and just do an average to decide who should be part of the department. So I'm going to drop in a summarize tool. And a summarize tool you can find either in this transform palette or in your favorites palette, unless you've removed it from your favorites. But really what I want to do here is I want to find the average for each of my students. So I should have 3 different averages. And each of them, I'm going to say, for each student, group by, give me numeric average. Okay. By grouping by them, I'm basically saying, hey, those 5 records that represented John, they should be grouped into one single record that represents average grade. In that sense, I'm really changing the level of my data, right? It was on a per subject basis, and now I'm just doing it on a per student basis. So I'm really changing the granularity of this. So if I were to go and run that, you could see that straight up, Mary looks like the highest. And of course, if I had a very, very large data set, it might be easier to make sure that my highest average sorts to the top. So I'm going to say average grade descending. And now I can see that Mary, by 2%, has the highest average grades across calculus, chemistry, literature, history, economics, and so forth. However, that's not how we necessarily want to run it. You can see that I also, inside this data set, have some sort of weighting. So you can see in this case that I've got a weighting for literature, since we're favoring our English department, that this is really more important to us, and it should be 3 times more important than that of chemistry, calculus, economics, and history. Now, if you don't have that natively within your data set, you certainly could do different things to get to this point of weight, right? If it's really only something as simple as maybe saying literature should only have this weight, you could create some sort of if-then statement through the formula tool that says, that assigns, if it's literature, give it the value of 3. If it's anything else, then give it the value of 1. So let's just, I'm going to remove that field just to show how we might get there and just recreate it using a formula tool. So I'm going to create a new column, and I'll call it weight. And then in here, I'm going to look up the function in which I can create some sort of condition. Okay, so I'm going to go to conditional and select this if-then else statement. So what I'll say is if the subject is equal to literature, then give it the value of 3, else give it the value of 1. So only the value of literature gets that 3 value, and anything else gets 1. And I'm going to make sure that this is an actual numeric value so it can be processed through our weighted average tool. So if you're not familiar with conditional statements, they're very easy to whip up, and you can see that I've done them. And I like to break them down a little bit here by entering returns. But all I've done is basically said, hey, if this field subject has the value of literature, then give this new value to the field that I'm just creating weight, or else give it 1. So when I run this again, you can see that I've recreated the field, and I can see that I have John with the value of 1. It wasn't literature, so it turned it to 1. This one was literature, so it turned it to 3, so on and so forth. So you can see it's really easy to do. Additionally, I could have had some sort of lookup table that may already have predefined weights that I could have added in. So there's many ways where you can get those weights. But let's go ahead and build out our weighted average. This one you'll find in the transform palette, the very last one. I'm going to drag that into the canvas. Okay, So really what I want to evaluate is our grades. So for my value field, and then I'm going to select my weight field. And this is something that I always think is really helpful is before you go into this tool, sometimes it's helpful to name the fields as they might match into this configuration. So instead of having some cryptically named field, sometimes having a field named weight, it's easier to map in. You can choose what you want the output value to be and then how you want to group it. Do we want to weight the average of the entire data set or on a per student basis? In this case, it makes sense to do it on a per student basis because I'm looking to accept one single student, not a whole data set. So let's go ahead and run and look at this one more time. So now, interestingly enough, John appears to be my highest weighted average. And I'm just going to sort this just to match what I did up here. I'm going to go to my weighted average, set that to descending. So look at how this changed my analysis. Before, I was going to accept Mary, then John if she declined, and then Bob. In this case, I've actually toggled John and Mary into different positions. It looks like John was a better performer for literature and thus a better performer for my university. So I, in turn, would extend my congratulations to John, and we fulfilled that spot. So that's our first use case all around the weighted averages. Is there any questions on that? I'll pause for a moment and allow the Q&A to fill up with any questions. If not, we can move on to the next one. How do you create a text input? That's an excellent question. So there's a couple ways you can do it. So what you can do is it's usually in your favorites palette, but if you can't find it there, you'll find it in your in and out palette. But all you do is simply drag this text input into your canvas. Okay, and this tool is ideally used for any time that you find it easy to populate your own data. Sometimes it's not contained in a file and you just want to add a few quick values to your workflow. So in this case, if I didn't have this weighted field, I might just want to add things like calculus, chemistry, literature, and add the weight manually. So all you do, it's simply like typing into any other spreadsheet. I can just type in here, calculus, literature, history. You can name the fields. And then I could give a weight field, and then 1 and 3, 1. And the nice thing about these is once you configure them, they're completely copy and pastable. So I can create multiple copies, and they still carry the values within there. Now, if you have something somewhere where you want to copy the values over, let's say I went to Excel here, and let me just copy some values out of Excel. So let's say I have some first names and last names. I'm going to copy those. I can bring in my text input, and you'll see I have this paste option. I can click that and quickly bring in these values. So that's another way that you can populate it. And then the final way, if you are so inclined, is I can drag this in, and you can see I can actually input a file directly here. So I could just put in customers. Well, probably has to be an Excel file here. Yeah, so you can actually just go in and add your file there, and what it'll do is essentially import into this text input tool. Now, one note that I am going to make is that this data is static. It doesn't change, so once it's brought into the tool, it's locked there. So if you're ever looking to use more dynamic data, use just the regular input data tool, which is what we'll use next, so we can look at that. Another good tip and trick that I'll share with you guys, just because it's fun, is that for the results, you can actually just copy those results and you can choose to copy them with headers or with not. And then you can just copy those, paste those results back into the canvas and get their average grade. So that's a quick way of creating text inputs as well. So let's go ahead and start our next task here. So I'm going to go ahead and connect to a few files here. So be patient with me for a few seconds here as we get up and running. So the first one I'm going to do is customers. I'm going to look at a customer file. And in here I can see I have a customer ID, some store information, the segment those customers belong to, and it looks like I have some lat and long information. And really I'm going to use these to figure out what customers are buying how much, right, and where they're located at in order to define that radius of sales that we talked about. So that's the first thing I'm going to connect to. The second one is I need to figure out how much my customers actually spent, and I know I have another file for that. So I'm going to go to Transactions. Again, I got there just by going to drop down, File, Browse, and selecting my Transactions file. And in here I can see I have an ID field, what they ordered, what the discount was, how much they paid per unit, right? What the total sales were, which is really the number that I want out of here. And then finally, I need to find where my store locations are. So I know I have another file for that, which is really, where the power of Alteryx comes in, is when we have to blend data together. So let me reconnect there. I connected to the wrong file. And I'm going to go to stores. So you can see I have store information here, where these stores are located at. And really what I want to say, hey, at this lat and long, what is 80% of the sales based on where my customers lat and long are at? Okay. Now some other tools that you might not be familiar with but are really helpful inside the Alteryx Designer is these Create Spatial Points tool. So whenever you have these lat long values, we actually have a tool that converts them to a little point on the map. So I'm going to drag in my Create Points tool. You can find it inside your spatial palette, Create Points. If you have trouble finding it, you can always go to this top bar and just type in Create Points and drag it in. So we'll go in here into the spatial points, and you can see that by default lat and long is there. I'm going to add a browse tool to the end so we can view where those spatial points are. Now, many of you might just see a white space with a bunch of pink reddish dots. What's happening there is you haven't chosen a base map, so you may be seeing this as your default. You can just go up inside the browse tool and select what base map you want. You may see some that I have that you may not have, but you can select them, and that way it gives more context. So clearly we can see off the bat, these are all customers in the Denver area. Now, what I really want to do is find out, basically blend these two data sets together. Where are my customers located and how much did they spend? And I just want to bring them into a single data set. So the first thing I'm going to do is just really identify how much each customer spent. Now, this file, based on its pure name, and I'm the business analyst, so I know this, so I know each record represents a transaction. So technically, my customer could have multiple transactions, so I need to aggregate the total sales per customer and make sure it's not transactional level, but at the level of our customer. So what I'm going to do is going to go in and bring in a summarize tool and say, for every customer, meta group, give me the sum of sales. I'll run that. And so now I have each customer ID and how much sales they spent. You may see that I'm not carrying forward any more fields than just these two. That's a total trademark of the Summarize tool, is anything that you have at the bottom of this configuration will be the only fields that result of that tool, especially since you're changing the aggregation by nature. So since we did it at customer level, it doesn't make sense to bring in shipping mode as an example, because they may have different shipping modes across all these transactions. So now we can see how much each of these customer sales spent, and I want to tie it in to these customer IDs over here. So we're ready to go into a join. And what I'm doing is bringing in both data sets into both sides of my join, one into the left and one into the right. And what I really want to look is the output of this J. This J basically says, hey, what was in this data set and this data set, what was shared? I'm only interested in customers that exist, that have actually purchased from this sales data set or this transactional data set. However, I need to pick some sort of criteria for these two data sets to match upon. So what I'm going to say is that the customers in this top data set should match to the customer ID in this data set. So I'm going to go ahead and add a browse at the end. And we'll go ahead and look and see what that result is. So you can see that I've got all this Latin long information where they exist, and that centroid, which is really what exists over here. And then you can see the other half of my data set, my customer ID, and how much they spent on the sum of sales. So now I know where each customer lives and how much they spent, all in one data set. Now it's time for me to figure out where they are in relation to my stores. So how are we going to do that? Well, you can see inside this data set, not only did I have the customer ID, I had what store they've been shopping at. And the good news is I have a store number here and a store ID here. I believe them to be the same thing, so I'm going to go ahead and blend them together and see what my result is. So again, I'm going to drag in a new join tool, bring this one into the right input, bring the join of the last one into the left output, and choose a logic to join these two on. In this case, I'm going to say where store number is equal to store ID. So now, if I add a browse, I really would just want to see customers that shopped at store locations and look at the results of that. Okay. So now if I look across my whole data set, I should also see that customers 2 shopped at store 100, which is this location. Okay. So we're getting to a point where we're in really good shape. We have a location designated for our customer, which you can actually see here on the map. It's very, very tiny. Let me see if I can boot my zooming software here, which it will not let me. Let me see if I can just bring this open a little bit more. There we go. So you can see here, very, very tiny, but I have 2 highlighted dots, one representing my customer and one representing my store. So we can see where they're at. And they highlight based on what you've selected on the map, so you'll see that they actually change. So we can see all these customers here relate to this store. Probably pretty hard to see on this WebEx. So now what we need to do is calculate how far our customers actually are from the store. Okay, so we see that I have 2. Over here I have my centroid and my right centroid. They're not named very optimally. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename what these fields are. And I can rename them using a select tool or just use the join tool that we just were at. So I'm just going to say for the first centroid, I'm going to call that customer location. And that's the rename field I just entered it into. And the second centroid, I'll just say this is store location. So now we have a tool specifically designated to measuring the distance between 2 points, and that's called the distance tool. So I'm going to say, how far is it from my customer location? And you can see it's automatically populated, detecting that it was a spatial object. How far is it to my store location, right? And what do you do when they output a distance, right? So we want a distance if they live on the top floor of the store. Maybe the store, it's a little shopping mall and there's apartments on top. What do you do if they're in the exact same location? Do you return a distance of 0, or do you want to return something else? In this case, that's fine. I know in my data set that's not the case. I could choose to output cardinal direction. I could choose whether I want that distance in feet, meters, kilometers, miles. I'll just choose miles in this case. And I'll go ahead and run that workflow once more. So now if I scroll all the way to the end of my data set, I can see how far that customer is from each of these store locations. If we want to observe it and see who's really the closest, what I'm going to do is just use a quick sort by miles, and ascending, saying, hey, whoever's nearest should be at the top of my data set, and whoever's the furthest be at the bottom. So you can see my closest living customer right now is less than 1/10 of a mile away. Okay, so now we're getting to that exciting part where we can really calculate a running total, right? How much accounts for 80% of my total sales. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my running total here and drag this into my canvas, okay? And what I'm going to do is create a running total for each store, right? Now that I've got these ordered in a certain order, I'll say, what was the running total for customer 1? What was the running total for customer 1, 2 who were closest? What was the running total for 1, 2, 3? So going into this running total tool, I really just want to, run a total on the sum of sales. And what I want to do is restart that running total for each store number. So each time I come to a new store, start all over, and we'll measure what 80% of the sales are for that store location. And let's go ahead and observe what that output looks like. So here you can see, if I scroll over to the right here, I'm working with store 100 right now. So I'll go over here a little bit more. This might be better just to, let me open this in a new window here very quickly, so we can observe this a little better. There we go. So let's scroll to the right here. You can see I'm working with store 100, and you can see that I've got a running total. So I can see that I'm essentially summing the first point of sale is 567. The second one is 567 plus the 6,133, and then adding each one individually, right? If we scroll down far enough, you can see that I get to store 101. And since I grouped it based on store, it starts all over again. So now I'm back to 220, the first sale for that store. Based on distance, you can see the closest one for this store is 0.23. I started at 220 and started counting up. So now I have, based on ascending distance, how much they've earned. So at what point down this list do we reach a point where we're 80% of our total sales? Well, first we need to calculate what our total sales were for this store. Essentially, this is going to be our numerator, and the other one's going to be our denominator. So let's go ahead and calculate that. So what I'm going to do is just do a quick summarize here and say for each store number, what was the total sales? So let's create sum, and you can see it's getting renamed oddly, so I'm just going to call this store total sales. So now I can see how much each store earned, and really I want to assign this value back into this data set. And this is really where the power of a good Alteryx designer user comes in, is they typically work in parallel and know all these ways to kind of tie data back to itself. So in this case, I know I have store number from this data set. I just want to add these values that I calculated here back in. And I want to do that based on my store number. So now when I run my workflow and I scroll all the way to the right, I can see what my total sales were and how much those were of my total sales. So we're just barely there. We're just a few steps away. I need to calculate what percent of this is equal to that. So in order to do that, I'm going to use a formula tool to get to that answer. And essentially I'm going to say what's 7,564 divided by this number, and what percent is that for my total store value? So I'm going to go in here and create this formula tool. I'm going to create a new field and call it percent of total. I'm going to give it a numeric value. And let's go ahead and write what that might be. I'm going to first prompt for my fields. A good user tip if you're working on the new formula tool is just to get all the fields available at this quick entry. You can just type an open bracket and look through there. So in this case, I'm just looking for my running total and divide it by, open bracket again, total sales. And you can see here I have a value in my data preview. So you can see it's for my first value within my data set, it's a very, very small percent of the total. So here we can see it's a very small percent. Now we're getting into, thousands, millions of a fraction. And we can scroll all the way down and just identify where we start to reach a threshold of 80%, right? Now, 80% could be defined different ways. You could do it by 0.8, or if you want to multiply it by this number by 100, that might be easier for you. In this case, we'll just say at 0.8 really represents our total. So what I'm going to do is say I want to remove any users for each of these stores that are essentially not within this 80% threshold. In order to do that, I'm going to use this filter tool, which removes records from my data set based on some sort of criteria. And I'll say, keep everything that has a percent of total less than or equal to 0.8. I'm going to add a browse tool really quickly to both of these. And I'd added them quickly by just clicking on the tool and pressing Control-Shift-B, which is a really great hotkey if you want to use that. And I'm going to run this one more time. Okay. So good. We ran that. Here's everything within this 80% range represented by this output. So let me pause here for a second and see if there's any questions. Okay. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and essentially find what that maximum distance was for each store. So we've captured everybody within the 80%. Now, what was the max person in here? How far away were they from each store? I'm bringing my summarize tool one more time. And since we're still doing analysis by store number, I'm going to group by there. I'm going to find what my max run total was. So I'm just going to select max. And then finally, what the max in-store miles was. So I'll just add max for that. So now my resulting data set says, hey, for 80%, the max distance for this store was 11.9 miles. The max for this store was 10.9, 12.1, 12.3. So now when I start to go through my next marketing campaign and I'm distributing coupons or flyers or newspaper ads, I really know that I need to be looking at this specific radius for this store in order to make sure that 80% of my purchasing customers are getting their deals. So that's the running tool in action, and it's a really powerful tool that you may start to find more and more reasons for along the way. So there's a question saying, do the red tick marks mean that Alteryx truncated the numbers? How do you truncate it yourself to a decimal point if you need to do? So that's a great question. So let me see if I can find one of my data sets that's doing that here. So here's a percent of total, right? If you ever want to view these values, you can just hover over them and say the displayed value was rounded to 6 decimal places for clarity, okay? And really, if you double click on these, you can actually see a little bit of a larger value. but there's a much larger value being stored in the machine. These are purely just display values that are logical to us users. We don't want to swamp people down in that analysis. Now, if you ever wanted to get to a point where, say, you wanted to round to the nearest decimal point, it might be easier. Let's do it with distance miles, right? Let's just round this to the nearest hundredth, right? We're only interested in hundredths. What can I do to work with that? Maybe I'll just do total. Let me find a good number that I like it with, because that's a spatial point. Let me just add a new input here, and we'll do it. So let's say I have a number like this, right? And I just want to arrange these down to the hundredths. What you can do to get there is go to the select tool. And this is the field that I'll be working with. And by default, everything is always set to this data type called double, which means it's the most precise. It's going to store the largest value or the most intricate values within the designer. But if you'd like things to be rounded, what you can choose to do is just go to fixed decimal. And basically you're saying, I want this never to exceed this many characters in total length and this many past the decimal point. So you can see that this is reading 19.6. And this is essentially saying that it's going to store 19 characters within this value, and 6 of them can be allotted to after the decimal. If you're looking just to adjust it to 2 characters, aka the hundredths, I'm just going to adjust that to 19.2. I'm going to run that, and now it's been adjusted. So now it's at the fixed length. Okay? And you can see also one thing to do note is it does round. Okay, so if I'm setting it to 2, you can see this is 15.567, but the result of this is 15.57, so it does round if you do truncate before, so you have a little bit more precision even for that value. So the question is, how do you get the calculated columns to be a different color font? So I'm guessing this is in reference to the formula tool. If you're working on anything prior to version 10, prior to version 11, they will just be static black text. It's not until version 11 that we have the syntactic highlighting, which is really good for breaking it down. So that's the reason why you might not be seeing it. Green column. Okay, so that's another. So there's one more thing that we'll call out then, is you're probably seeing these right here, these green columns. Someone is asking, what are these green columns and what do they do? What these are is it's a new function of Alteryx 11.0 as well that represents our data profiling tool. And really, it's not a very good representative because we have a pretty clean data set here. But if I were to go into another data set here and make it kind of junky and it has empty values in it, you can see that I've essentially changed how these green values are showing up. And if I hover over them, it's going to say, oh, 50% of your data set is null and 50% of it is okay, aka it's populated. When you saw this over here, it was all green, basically meaning everything was populated, everything's looking good. And also with 11.0, if you see this browse tool, we also have this option called profile, in which I can select field by field and see what that quality of data looks like. So for my customer segment, I can see what the segments were, what that distribution was there any values with white space in them, what the average length was, the longest length, the shortest value, the longest value. And if I were to choose something like maybe sales, sum of sales, you can see that my view changes. I can actually see what those values are on the scale. Down here I have a little note of what the actual range of data was, where the mean and the median was, how many non-nulls, what's the minimum value, max, average, standard deviation. So any of this highlighting that you see here is actually representative of our data profiling functionality that we have new in 11.0. there any more questions? So just to cover off on a few things, if you ever have any questions about this training here or you want to know more about these tools, strongly recommend going to community.alteryx.com. There you can actually look and see if people have asked that same question that you're asking and if it's been solved. Or you could just ask your own question and have experts answer your question very quickly. If you need any technical support, just contact us at support@alteryx.com and we'll get you up and running. After this class, you'll be redirected to a survey. It's always meaningful for us to see if you found this course useful, if you'd like to see it run again in the future, as well as other courses that you want to see in the future that might help you. So thank you for joining. I'll just hang on the line for a minute or so more and see if any more questions come through.